This podcast episode was made possible in part with support from Sacred Rights, a Henry Luce Foundation-funded project hosted by Northeastern University that promotes public scholarship on religion. I highly recommend you learn more about Sacred Rights on their website, sacred-rights.org, that's WRITES, or find Sacred Rights on Twitter at sacred_rights. Food history is a universally applicable topic that can be relevant to every person's life. Learning food history can have the effect of opening a person's mind and palate to a new taste, a new sensation, a new life story. Talking about food on this podcast is a topic I will never tire of just because we all eat, and sitting down at a table together has the power to unite and build bridges across races, cultures, religions, and life stories. On this episode, I am so excited to bring you a conversation about ethics within the Jewish community farming movement with Dr. Adrienne Krone. This wide-ranging conversation talks about our shared local connection of Buffalo, New York, Jewish farming and youth camps, human-induced climate impacts, and more. Dr. Adrienne Krone is Assistant Professor of Religious Studies and Director of Jewish Life at Allegheny College. She has a Ph.D. in American Religion from Duke University. Her research focuses on contemporary religious food justice movements in North America, and her current project is an ethnographic and historical study of the Jewish community farming movement. You can follow Adrienne Krone on Twitter at Adrienne Krone, and you can follow me on Twitter at classical_ideas. Without further delay, enjoy this conversation on ecological ethics within the Jewish community farm movement. Dr. Adrienne Krone, welcome to Classical Ideas.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Welcome to my house. This is a special conversation for me because I do so few of these actually in person, and I'm just delighted because in-person conversations have such a different tone and feel to them for episodes. You know what I mean? Like, it's just so different.
Yeah. I'm really excited to be here in person and not be doing Zoom after a year of Zoom. Exactly.
So you don't have a screen in front of you.
I don't.
Which is fabulous. I do because I have notes and everything, but the feeling of being with another person in a room, it just is so special. And I have had one of your Sacred Rights, the primary investigator, Dr. Elizabeth Bucar, on the show. And we recorded in person similarly to this, and it was one of my favorite episodes I've ever done because Dr. Bucar is so fantastic, but also because of that in-person feeling. It's just so wonderful.
Yes. I don't know that I can live up to Dr. Bucar, but I'm excited to be here in person and to do this in person.
Well, can you just spend a moment and introduce yourself to the audience however you see fit, just so we know who you are and what you do and kind of like what your expertise is in?
Yeah, so I am currently an assistant professor of religious studies at Allegheny College, which is a small liberal arts college south of Erie, Pennsylvania. I also teach there in the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program and in the Environmental Science and Sustainability program because of the research that I do. And in addition to my academic role at Allegheny, I'm also the director of Jewish Life there. So I have a lot of different things that I get to do. My training is in religious studies. I have a Ph.D. in American Religion from Duke University. And I've been researching religious food justice movements for about 10 years now. So that is where my research lies, primarily at the moment in the Jewish community farming movement.
Wonderful. And we're recording this in my house, which is in Snyder, New York, which is a suburb of Buffalo. And I know that you are from practically here, just across the bridge over in Williamsville. Can you talk a little bit about growing up in Buffalo and religion stuff? I'm curious where like your origin story is because we're so hyper local to where you're from and to where I live.
Yeah, no, that's part of why I was thrilled to come in person. I was born and raised in Buffalo. I initially lived in Clarence with my family, and then we moved into Williamsville when I was in first grade, and then I went through the Williamsville schools, graduated from Williamsville East, and my entire life was spent in addition to school, in the Jewish community in Buffalo.
Wonderful.
So I went to preschool at the Jewish Community Center, the JCC. I worked there later as an adult. I was a lifeguard there for a long time. And we belonged to Temple Beth Am, which has since become Shir Shalom. And so we went to religious school there. I had a bat mitzvah there. My entire life was spent kind of in and amongst the Jewish community here in Buffalo.
I know I've driven past Shir Shalom. Where is that precisely? I can't remember.
It's on Sheridan.
Yeah. Sheridan and Forest.
Sheridan and Forest.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Wonderful. I drive past there on the way to Wegmans every single time.
Wegmans is another favorite place of mine, and I worked there in high school as well.
Fabulous. Did you work at the Williamsville Sheridan Wegmans?
No, I worked on Transit Road.
Okay, cool. Yeah. I go to the Sheridan one just down the street because it's only a couple minutes away from me. I love it. So what was your, did you have a specific spiritual practice within the family? Kind of where was that taking you?
Yeah. So Temple Beth Am was a Reformed congregation. Now it's a Reformed congregation and a Reconstructionist congregation merged. And
Wonderful.
So it's a little bit different now. But when I grew up there, it was a Reformed congregation. And I talk about my family's practice, and my current practice was very liberal, but very kind of dedicated to practicing. And so my family celebrated Shabbat most weeks. We didn't turn off everything. We didn't turn off the TV and turn off the lights or anything, but we had Shabbat dinner together, and we often went to Shabbat services together. And so we regularly practiced, even though the way we were practicing wasn't necessarily following exactly all of the laws for Shabbat.
But it was it was a mindset, right?
Yes.
It was a shift in mindset at the end of the week that kind of the family could go through together. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And my parents were educators as well. So my mom taught math. She taught middle school math for 33 years, I think.
Amazing.
My dad taught high school science and then became a principal. People in Buffalo will know Dr. Krone. He was the principal of Williamsville North for many years.
Love it.
The first Dr. Krone. And so really all of us, after a very busy week in different schools, would kind of come together and have usually a quick Shabbat dinner. Often it was chicken fingers fried up with some Frank's Red Hot. This Buffalo after all.
Oh, yeah.
And then we would either head to the synagogue or just kind of sit down together.
So since I've moved here, the Jewish community in Buffalo, I've gotten to know some families. Some of my past students that I taught here in Buffalo have been a part of the Jewish community here in town, and it seems very strong, very vibrant. And there's a camp not too far away, Camp Centerland, and I'm wondering if you did any of the camps or anything like that growing up, and if you have any stories about that.
Yeah, we did some day camping when we were younger, but because my parents had summers off for a good portion of my life, and my dad eventually had to work during the summer when he became an administrator. But before that and through that, my mom still had the summers off. So we would go to the JCC and hang out by the pool pretty much every day. Yeah. But we weren't kind of participating in some of the Jewish day and overnight camping to the same extent as some of the other families and friends of mine in the community.
Wonderful. Well, I want to know more about your areas of expertise. So you have this rich backstory behind, your own spiritual practices within your family, and then you become a scholar within those areas as well. Yeah. And I want to know about your path through academia that kind of led you to where you are now as a professor at Allegheny.
Yeah. So I talk to students about this a lot. I think we think about paths as I have a plan and I'm going to follow the plan and then I'm going to do this. And that is not how my path worked at all. What happened is I had a pretty significant medical procedure when I was 12. I had brain surgery. And so it happened at a time where I was studying for my bat mitzvah. And so in the midst of, preparing for this very important religious experience, I had this other whole thing happening where all of my friends who mostly weren't Jewish, from school, were saying, we're going to pray for you in my church and in my places of worship, and Protestant churches, Catholic churches, UU churches, the whole spectrum. And I was like, what does this mean? And so for a long time, the path was kind of, well, I'll be a doctor because medical things happen to me and I'll help people with medical things. But these questions of the religious aspects of what was happening to me at that same time kind of stuck with me. And when I got to college, I was, a pre-med bio major, but I was going to do a religious studies minor.
Yeah.
And so I started taking some classes, and then I was just so interested in the religious studies classes and in my Jewish studies classes. And not that bio is not interesting, but it was not maybe my interest.
Sure.
And so I just kind of shifted perspective and ended up majoring in religious studies, minoring in Jewish studies, and figuring out a new path. And I ended up after college studying for a year at a modern Orthodox yeshiva.
Oh, cool.
In New Jersey, called the Institute of Traditional Judaism, and then worked for the National Office of the Jewish Community Centers for a while, before figuring out okay, maybe this is where my real interest is. I'll go back to grad school. And so then eventually I went for a master's and Ph.D.
Can I ask you about the yeshiva? What was it that took you to a modern Orthodox yeshiva after growing up in a Reform family? Was there interest in becoming more intensely practicing within your own spiritual life?
Not more intensely practicing, but there was a time where, you have a religious studies bachelor's degree and you're trying to figure out what to do with it. And I was like, well, I could be a rabbi.
Sure.
And to be a rabbi, I should learn something about text study and Talmud.
Yeah.
And so that seemed like a good path to there. And it ended up being a kind of path to, I'm actually interested in taking a step back and looking at how religion works and what it's doing, more so than I'm interested in, being the rabbi telling people what to do.
Sure. I mean, I love those accidental stumbling points within life stories as well, because I've talked about this on the show before, but I dropped out of a social studies PhD program before comprehensive exams because I was like, this is not right for me. I don't know what my path is within this. And then I stumbled into a high school English teaching job where I also got to teach world religions. And I was like, boom, new pathway has opened up. And here I am doing this kind of work all these years later after having that amazing opportunity in 2013. So it's a really interesting story whenever I talk to people about their own life stories. You know what I mean? Because we always sort of stumble along, and then we a door opens, and then we walk right through it, and life is never the same after.
Exactly.
I love it. What was your PhD program pathway?
Yeah, so the track that I was in at Duke is called American Religion. So I have a lot of training in, history of religion in America, which is primarily Christianity. And then I picked up Jewish studies kind of continually alongside. And so the way Duke's program works, you have what they call an external minor. And so I took a lot of classes in anthropology because I do ethnographic work. I go to Jewish farms and interview people. So I needed some skills in that area. And then internally, I minored in Jewish studies.
Wonderful.
And kept up the study of the Jewish world more broadly than just the United States.
Nice. Well, so I want to get into a little bit of your specific areas involving food.
Yes.
And the reason why I love your topic so much is that every single person in the world is interested in food in some way.
It's true.
It is the most relevant topic. And so whenever I think about a person in religious studies who studies food, I'm like, well, you have the most relevant topic imaginable because everybody eats. And food is so inherently and intrinsically interesting to everybody on the world. And it emerges consistently on this show as a topic. I've had the famous chef Eric Ripert.
I know. That was an impressive interview.
I really was blown away in hearing him talk about his career and his spiritual path and how they conflict and how they merge. So powerful for me. And then your colleagues Nora Rubel and Ben Zeller have been on the show to talk about foodways. Down in Baltimore, my friends Harold Morales and Kareem Amin both talked about urban farming in Baltimore and how they're working with religious communities for urban farming. So food and religion matter a lot. And I love talking about food. What inspires you about food and food justice that said, this is for me?
Yeah. So I'm trying to think where to start. So I'll start with when I was starting, I did my master's and PhD at the same place, which is not necessarily the case for everybody.
Right.
And so I kind of restarted into a PhD program with my same advisor, and I was working as his research assistant. And he was doing, my advisor was David Morgan. He does a lot of work on material culture. And so he was doing a project on religion and the senses and had me look into figuring out some more sources. He does a lot of visual culture, and so he was like, figure out, smell and taste and touch and the hearing, and so I was looking at a lot of things, and I came back to him and I said, I figured out the answer. The place where the senses are all happening is food, right?
Love it.
You're smelling it, you're tasting it, you're touching it, it's sizzling, it's popping, it's beautiful or not beautiful, but
Totally
enticing.
beautiful. Totally.
And he was not necessarily interested in diving down the path of studying food, but I was. And so this is, where you kind of negotiate with your advisor. And so I was like, I'm going to start looking into this. This is really interesting to me. And I started with looking at some of the historical food movements in the U.S. because a lot of American religion programs are a little bit history focused. And I got to people like Sylvester Graham, who in the 1830s was like, processed food is the problem. People need to bake their own bread again. And the reason we still have he would hate graham crackers as they currently are with like processed flour and sugar. But graham flour, right, unbolted wheat, was part of his thinking about what kind of food people should be eating. And he was a Christian pastor, and he did it from a Christian perspective. And I was like, these same things are happening today. And I found it so interesting that food, in part because, like you're saying, people, have to think about food multiple times a day to get through the day. And so it's a place where people are often enacting religious values and actually putting into practice some of the things that, like, they're thinking about in their worlds and how they should be human, which is deeply, like, often integrated into their religious ideas.
Yeah, and a person's value system comes out very clearly in what they choose to consume, and there's a huge conversation that you could go down as far as like food ethics and sourcing, and like if you're going to be involved in like eating animal products and things like that. So it is such an important conversation that exists in every facet of human existence because it's endlessly impactful upon the earth and other species and value systems in general. There's so much commentary there. And I'm wondering, in your view, why does the religious history of food matter to people who are of different religions? So, like, for example, why should a Christian person care about Jewish food history and things like that?
Yeah, I think it's important to understand, especially in things like food, right? To understand a little bit about the people that we share this planet with. We live people talk about this all the time. We live in a kind of increasingly multicultural society, multi-religious society. And it's a helpful thing to know a little bit about the things that matter so deeply to people that they've changed or maybe have never eaten particular things. And it's helpful to think about, like, if I'm having a friend over, what kinds of questions should I be asking about what kinds of things they eat, right? Or maybe just not asking, but presuming that if a Muslim or a Jewish friend is coming over, you're not serving them pork chops.
Sure.
Right? And so some of it's just being a person in the world.
Yeah.
But also, like, with the example of Sylvester Graham, like, religious food ideas and religious food practices come into popular culture and come into grocery store shelves in ways that we don't really think about it. The kosher food industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry that serves many more people than Jewish people. A lot of people look for those labels because they indicate that, if something says parv, which means like neither dairy nor meat, that helps a vegan or a vegetarian figure out whether they can eat something. That helps a Muslim or maybe not, halal isn't marked on as many foods.
Right.
And so having a sense of what's available is also really important, and what ends up on grocery store shelves and how it's labeled.
I love the idea of labeling too, because as you mentioned, like there may be a shortage of things that are specifically halal that are labeled. So what that is that's like a goal for the future. Because you look at certain types of foods that are labeled well, and you're like, okay, where can we do better in other traditions as far as labeling goes? Because as you mentioned, like the country diversifies so rapidly that those things will continue to matter. So like I see that as like a goal for traditions to be able to have food that is more labeled and specific across the board. You know what I mean?
Absolutely, absolutely, and more available, right? I live in relatively rural Pennsylvania, and a holiday like Passover comes up where Jews don't eat leavened bread and have to eat this very unleavened bread called matzah.
Yeah.
And the grocery stores in town sometimes will carry matzah, which, it's much appreciated, but you go look at the box and it says not kosher for Passover. Right? And so it's the matzah that they produce like the rest of the year, where they're also making cookies in the factory.
Wow.
And so then the Jewish people who live in town are like, we really appreciate it. It still doesn't work for this holiday.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's like negotiating some of these complicated details.
I didn't even know such a product even existed.
It's a mystery
to
a lot of people. Yeah.
When you come to town here, do you like go to the like Wegmans or something, and you like stock up on certain things?
So there's a Wegmans in Erie, where I do a significant portion of my shopping. Here I was thinking I might try to stop at Trader Joe's today.
Yeah.
I don't have that nearby me in Pennsylvania.
Excellent. Well, I want to talk a little bit about some of your specific work. I read a chapter of yours called Ecological Ethics in the Jewish Community Farming Movement, which came out in the book Feasting and Fasting, The History and Ethics of Jewish Food, which was edited by Aaron S. Gross, Jody Myers, and Jordan S. Rosenblum. And I'm wondering what the overall premise tying these chapters together in this book is about. What's like the underlying message with this particular book?
Yeah. So the underlying message is basically that Jewish people are since the beginning of time to now thinking about food, right? There's this whole system of food laws that means that Jews are often more conscious of the decisions they're making in this area.
Yeah.
Because even if they don't keep kosher, they've made a decision to not keep kosher, right? And so it's something they're thinking about, even if they're not thinking about it in a way of following every single law, right? And so it's on Jewish minds.
Gotcha.
And the book has 3 sections. So there's a history section that goes through, like, what did this look like in different periods?
Yeah.
There's a food and culture section where you get other kinds of American products like Crisco, which have these like really Jewish histories. That's a great chapter by Rachel Gross.
I want to have her on the show so much.
She's fabulous. And then my chapter is in the ethics section and thinking about, how are, mostly in that section, it's contemporary Jews thinking about what they're eating when the food system looks so completely different than it looked when, in the time of the ancient Israelites, or even in the time of the Middle Ages, where a lot of the rabbis were working out particulars for their communities of practice all over the world. And so thinking about, given some of the practices that are pretty standard now with factory farming and environmental degradation, and what are we supposed to be eating?
Yeah.
Right?
I love it. Okay, so so the ending of the title in your chapter is Jewish Community Farming Movement.
Yes.
Okay. And this is something that I know nothing about, and I'm very excited to learn about it. So tell me all about the Jewish Community Farming Movement.
Yeah. So I'll say, first of all, a lot of times people think this is new. And so one of the things to keep in mind is that, like, the Hebrew Bible is a record of an agricultural people, right? So a lot of the laws in the Torah, in the whatever you want to call it, the Torah, the Hebrew Bible, a lot of the laws are about how to grow food, when to harvest it, what to do when you harvest it, how to offer some of it back to God.
Yeah.
And so agriculture was like deeply ingrained in Jewish life. And then Jews kind of moved off the land in similar ways to many other peoples all over the world, became a little bit more urban, got into trade in part because of, often cases because they didn't have access to land,
Right?
and were useful in things like trade because of their language skills and networks all over the world. But there have been movements of Jews in agriculture throughout history, right? So in the 19th century, Jews coming out of Eastern Europe who were facing oppression there got resettled both in the United States and in what was then Ottoman Palestine to do agriculture and be self-sufficient and not have to rely on other people. And so there were agriculture projects all over the United States at that point. They didn't last super long. A lot of those Jews ended up moving back into cities and doing other things. And so the contemporary movement isn't, maybe as different from other forms of Judaism that people sometimes think about it. But this movement started in 2004 with the founding of Adamah at the Isabella Freedman Jewish Retreat Center in Falls Village, Connecticut. And it was kind of an intentional, sustainable agriculture program that integrated some of these biblical ideas about growing food and some of these ethical ideas about like what Jews should be eating in the 21st century into that farm. And then that farm started running a fellowship program where 20-somethings kind of come from all over to spend 3 months in a kind of an immersive experience and learn about sustainable agriculture. And once cohorts of those fellows started finishing the program and going elsewhere, they started establishing Jewish farms all over. And so now there's they kind of ebb and flow. So some of the farms that used to exist have kind of said, we've done our thing in our place and we're going to do something else for a while. And so there's usually around 20 operating at any one time.
Interesting.
All over the U.S. And then there's one in Canada that I visit when we are allowed to go to Canada.
Where is the Canadian location?
It's in and around Toronto. It's called Shorish Jewish Environmental Programs.
Awesome.
And I actually have a recent chapter out in a book called Valuing Lives, Healing Earth, about their pollinator repopulation program. They're really focused on what climate change and environmental loss has done to the bee population.
Wow. Yeah. I love that. Where are some, you don't have to list all of them, obviously, so there are so many, but where are some of the locations that you are most interested in for these farms around the country?
So I'm not going to say most interested because I'm interested in all of them.
Of course.
But there's actually a recent merger that I'm keeping an eye on. So Isabella Freedman that I mentioned, which has Adamah, that was the kind of first Jewish community farming organization, had already merged. So Isabella Freedman had already merged with Hazon, which is a national Jewish environmental nonprofit.
Okay.
And those two organizations have now recently merged with Pearlstone, which is another retreat center with a farm outside of Baltimore. And so that's a place to pay attention. That's the biggest, not just Jewish, but religious environmental group, nonprofit environmental organization in the U.S.
Amazing.
And so that's a place I'm keeping an eye on. There's a lot of growth in these farming organizations in California, in Colorado, in Detroit, there's 2 farms in North Carolina now that were not there when I lived in North Carolina. So that's very exciting, but also I feel like I missed out a little bit. In the chapter, I talk about Eden Village Camp, which is in upstate New York, where a lot of Jewish camps have gardens, but Eden Village Camp is centered around their farm.
Okay, well, let's segue into that because this chapter centers around Eden Village, which sounds like such an amazing place. In the chapter, I was like, this is incredible. The skills that the kids who go there are learning and practicing is just immense. And, we talked a little bit about Centerland here in Buffalo, and it always looks so fun whenever I ride my bike through the University at Buffalo bike path right there. I drive right past their climbing wall and stuff on my bike. And, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on Jewish summer camps in general in the U.S. Because there's these farming ones, and then there's non-agricultural ones. Obviously, what's this like?
Yeah. So Jewish camp. There's a lot of research on Jewish camping. And really what it is an immersive, like, weeks-long or months-long experience for Jewish kids to come to a place where everyone around them and everything that's happening is Jewish, which is not their day-to-day experience.
Sure.
No matter where they live, right?
Yeah.
So even if they live in a city with a big Jewish population and maybe they go to a Jewish day school, the world around them is still not, like, entirely Jewish or majority
Right.
Jewish.
Yeah.
And so what Jewish summer camps in general provide for young Jewish Americans is this immersive experience where everyone around them and everything that they're doing is Jewish. And that's really rare in a place where the Jews make up about 1.9% of Americans.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's not something that they can find day to day. And that's part of what has happened with the Jewish farming movement as well, is they have these fellowship programs for an older cohort of young people, of 20 now they're young people to me, of 20 somethings. And they can go for 3 months and immerse themselves in sustainable agriculture from a Jewish perspective.
Awesome.
And Jewish learning. And so it's a similar strain of Jewish life where it's offering a kind of complete immersive day-to-day experience where everything around them is Jewish.
Awesome. Okay, so let's talk about Eden Village.
Yeah.
This place sounds very special. You described their kosher, organic, fair trade, local, sustainable practices. So they have many goals. And I'm wondering how you came to realize that this camp, Eden Village, is sort of special.
Yeah. So part of what happens is that the world of Jewish community farming is pretty small, and some of the leadership at Eden Village were helping organize the Jewish community farming movement into conferences, into working on some shared goals and some shared practices and some shared language to use with funders, very practical things.
Yeah.
And so I met some of the folks from Eden Village through starting to go to some of these conferences on Jewish community farming.
Yeah.
And Eden Village is one of the earliest projects to kind of come out of this kind of new-ish Jewish farming movement. And when I visited for a family camp weekend, and once you're there, you just kind of immediately see how different it is than other Jewish camps I've been to, right? So the farm is like front and center, and what I talk about in the chapter is at a meal, before anybody eats, they do a food tour, right? Where they say, here are the foods that you're going to be eating that come directly from our farm. And here are the campers that picked them. And and this group of campers planted them. And here, one of the things I talk about in the chapter is I was there when they were finally introducing tuna, because they had finally found a supplier of what they felt was like the appropriate level of sustainable and ethical and kosher tuna fish, which is really hard to come by.
Yeah.
And Eden Village, I'll say, is special enough that they've now established a West Coast site. So now there's Eden Village in upstate New York, and then there's Eden Village West in Northern California. So they've now gone bi-coastal, so more kids can do this kind of immersive, not only Jewish experience, but farming experience.
Tell me a little bit about the setting here. So when you enter this camp, I'm wondering what the residences, if they're like the camping halls, like what the farm is like kind of set the stage here, paint a picture.
It's been a bit since I've been there, but I'll say the last time I was there, you kind of, drive down a driveway, and there's, beautiful setting. There's a lake, there's trees. It's an amazing, beautiful camp. And in front of you, you see kind of the main dining hall, a basketball court, and then to the right, like a huge, I think it's a full acre farm.
Okay.
And so it's right there at the entrance. It's where the campers start their day, right? So they all kind of gather together there in the morning, and they rotate through there throughout the day. So different groups of campers will kind of come in, and maybe they're planting, maybe they're weeding, maybe they're just learning about some of these agricultural laws in the Torah. But they're spending time there every day. It's not a kind of optional, like sometimes we swim, sometimes we do music.
Right.
It's part of what they do. And then there's also an herbalism program.
Oh, cool.
Right. So based in what they're growing, right, then they're also thinking about herbalism and tinctures and things that kids are learning about to like help with their scrapes and bruises that they get at camp. So it's integrated into every aspect.
I love it. Well, and farming is not easy. Gardening is not easy. This is hard work. And I'm wondering how they divide up the labor for these kids so that it's not overwhelming, so that they enjoy it and don't come to hate it. Like, I'm wondering how they balance all this.
Yeah. So I would say, first of all, I think people are self-selecting into this camp, right? There's plenty of Jewish camps. If kids don't want to do farming,
Sure.
They probably aren't going to
That's
eat in
true.
village.
That makes sense.
But I think it's really manageable, and the kids get so excited, right? When the dining hall is announcing that they're serving salsa made with tomatoes that almost everybody on camp helped with some piece of. Maybe they pruned the tomatoes, maybe they planted the tomatoes, maybe they weeded around the tomatoes, maybe they put up the trellises for right? When they finally serve that salsa, it's like everyone is like, I helped with this. I did this. And it was hot and I was tired and I got scratched up, but I did it. Right? And it makes the experience different.
I always tell my students and my daughter, I was like, doing hard things is worth it.
Yeah.
Because even if you are unhappy in particular moments, the payoff is always like a feeling of accomplishment. Like, holy smokes, I did what? And so I'm always telling people that doing hard things is worthwhile.
Yeah. And it helps, if you think about like the kinds of things kids eat and don't eat, right? It helps. A lot of the kids will eat things at Eat in Village that they maybe don't eat at home or in their school cafeterias because they helped grow the broccoli. So maybe they don't usually eat broccoli, but this time when it's served and they say this, group of campers helped with this broccoli and it's you.
Yeah.
You're going to put some broccoli on your plate.
I'm wondering about the text lessons as well that the campers are getting along the way. Like, tell me what the counselors or the leaders of the camp are like talking about, like with like Jewish texts along the way that complement the actual farming experience.
Yeah, so they have a lot of examples, of course, but one of the examples is they have a whole curriculum around challah, which is the traditional bread that Jews eat on Fridays for Shabbat. And as it happens, there are 39 forbidden practices that form the basis of the laws for Shabbat, for the work that you cannot do in Shabbat.
Sure.
And most of those 39 practices have to do with harvesting grain, planting, sowing, reaping, threshing grain to make challah, right? It's all about like this bread that is made. And so they do these units where students, see wheat in the field and they learn what planting is. They learn what threshing is.
Yeah.
Like, very sharp tools and teach them how to use them. And then they're winnowing and they're doing all of these pieces and they're learning how those kind of translate into the laws that Jews follow all over the world and avoid, like these practices that Jews avoid doing on Shabbat. So most of the like rules about now electronics and lights and all of these things that people are often thinking about when they think about the laws of Shabbat are all based on a prohibition of lighting a fire to bake your bread.
Gotcha.
Right? And so most Jewish camps serve challah on Fridays. At Eat in Village, they're like, and here's this whole world of like Jewish text and tradition that we have because people were thinking about the entirety of the process to get bread on the table on Friday night.
I love it. What are you still curious about with regards to the Jewish farming movement? What are like you looking at as far as like continuing this line of work?
Yeah, so I am more focused now on thinking about the work that these farms are doing as the climate crisis really becomes more visible and more present. There's a Jewish farm in California, in Malibu at the Shalom Institute that they lost, I think it was 95% of their buildings and grounds to the Woolsey fire.
Wow.
And so not only are Jewish farms thinking about climate change and thinking about the climate crisis, they're experiencing it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm paying a lot more attention to that even than I was 5 or 6 years ago, which I think speaks to like how much more we're seeing now than we were in 2015, 14, 13 when I started going to these places.
Wow.
I'm also paying more attention to animals. I'm part of the American Academy of Religion and Animals group. I'm on the committee for that, and so I've been paying more attention to bees, to goats, to chickens, to other animals that are part of these farms as well. A lot of them have husbandry programs, and they're teaching kids like where eggs come from and what chickens look like if they're not broiler hens, right? What do heritage chickens look like? And how often do they lay eggs if they're not this kind of like industrialized chicken that lays an egg every day, right?
Are you interested at all in the writings of Jonathan Safran Foer?
Yeah, I use him a lot in my classes. So I teach a course that's cross-listed at Allegheny with environmental science and sustainability and religious studies called Judaism, Justice, and Food.
Mm-hmm.
And at times, I have assigned the entirety or pieces of both Eating Animals and his newer book, We Are the Weather, where he's thinking about like food in relation to climate change.
I haven't seen that new book. Is it good?
It's good. He kind of walks through, which is really helpful for people to kind of step back and think about, right? A lot of times with the climate crisis, we see these numbers of like the small number of oil companies that are causing like most of the emissions, right? And agriculture is a huge contributor to greenhouse gases.
Yeah.
But we don't often think about it as much, right? Because people figure, oh, well, we need to eat, so some of that has to be a given.
Right.
And that's just not true. And what what Jonathan Safran Foer does in that book is he really walks through like, yes, we need to address the oil companies. We need to address like oil and gas and these big companies that have these huge impacts. But we also need to do the other pieces, right? And the only way we're already, right, the recent IPCC report is pretty terrifying, right? We're already well on our way to 1.5 degree increase or 2 degree increase. And to think about cutting back, it needs to be everywhere.
Yeah.
And so he really works through an argument in his like, humorous and heartbreaking and really approachable language with, yes, it has to be the big things, but it has to be the little things too.
Yeah.
And it's called We Are the Weather because he talks about like, we're part of this, right? The decisions you're making day to day and what you're putting on your plate are part of how we are both contributing to, but also can mitigate the climate crisis.
So this is really interesting too, because you grew up in the town that we're sitting in, and Buffalo is a notoriously mild place, right? And right now it is sweltering outside. It's 90 degrees outside right now. And everybody that I talk to who has grown up here is like, it was never 90 degrees when I was a kid, almost never. And I'm from Missouri, so I'm used to 90 plus degree summer days. But the other day I was looking at Missouri's weather, and it was like a heat index of 115. Yeah. And that is like, this is so extreme. And so 90 degrees in Buffalo, and this is one of the warmest, if not the warmest August on record here in this particular city. And, there's been a reduction in snowfall. Yes. There's been multiple melts where the snowpack will melt all the way to the grass and then snow again. So Buffalo, I feel like, is changing before my very eyes. And I think that you're probably noticing that as well.
Absolutely. I think in part because I moved away for a long time.
Yeah.
So I lived here through high school. I came back a lot during college, but then I lived in North Carolina for 7 years.
Hot.
I was very hot the whole time. And what I noticed when I finally came back and was living in Northwest Pennsylvania, but visiting family here more often,
sure.
and south of Erie is a very similar climate to Buffalo.
Exactly.
Is how much it had changed.
Yeah.
We get snow much later. And like you're saying, like when I was a kid, like the snow would start coming before Thanksgiving and you wouldn't see grass again. Maybe there would be, one weird week where it was like 60 degrees one time in January.
Yeah.
But other than that, it would be snowpack for the whole winter.
Mm-hmm.
It would be, there was a winter break where I was home from college for like a month. So most of December, January. And the temperature never went above freezing.
Yeah.
And that's just not what's happening right now.
Yeah.
It's much warmer. There's less snow. Then there's stranger snow patterns, right? So it's still the lake effect, but because the lake doesn't freeze
right
as soon,
yeah,
the lake effect snow is happening later in the year than it used to.
Yeah.
And so I think especially because I had spent time away and was expecting particular weather patterns when I came back, I was really aware of how much it had changed.
So you have such a wide range of interests here. We've talked about everything from food to climate catastrophe. And, you're currently working with Sacred Rights, which is a public scholarship in religion, amazing research organization that I'm highlighting every single scholar who works with Sacred Rights. And I'm wondering, what is your primary takeaway from some of the Sacred Rights trainings and how you can feel your skills growing and developing to get these messages out there?
Yeah. The training has been unbelievably helpful this summer. We've kind of had weekly units all summer, and it's really helped me reframe how I think about my scholarship. I'm used to, and I actually applied for Sacred Rights because of conversations I've had with students, where they'll say things like, "You're doing this work, it seems important, maybe you should tell more than just us."
Yeah.
And so I'm really trying to think about how I can do that and how I can try to reach more people with information. A lot of times the stories that get written about religion and climate, especially, or religion and the environment, focus on, and totally understandably for the United States where most people are Protestant, right? But focus on like Protestant or even Catholic interpretations that are really different than Jewish interpretations.
Sure.
And really different than how Jews understand their responsibility to the earth, to each other, to the plants and the animals, right? And to the kind of world around them in moments like this, but also in moments when things aren't as catastrophic.
Right.
And so kind of getting some of these alternative narratives out there, that it's not just that like all religious people don't care about climate change or don't believe in climate change. Like, that is not the case in Judaism. Most American Jews are like, yes, climate change is real and we should probably do something about it.
Yeah.
And so getting some of that information out to the public, that collapsing like religious people think, right, never works and doesn't work in that case.
So what are some of your goals working within public scholarship, and what are you working on?
Yeah, I'm actually mid-editing on a piece for The Revealer. They're
Awesome.
doing a whole special issue on religion and the climate crisis.
Fabulous.
And so the piece that I'll have, hopefully, as part of that through the editing process, is on Jewish farming and the climate crisis.
Amazing.
And some of the work that's happening on these Jewish farms. So we're about to enter, so speaking of some of these biblical laws, right, we're about to enter into a year that's called the Shemitah year, which is a Jewish year of kind of agricultural release. So the same way Jews, traditionally work for 6 days and rest on the seventh. There are laws in the Hebrew Bible that say you can work the land for 6 years, but then you have to let it rest in the seventh.
Interesting.
And so that year starts on Rosh Hashanah on September 6th. And so a lot of Jews, especially this year, are thinking about like, this is a good moment to pause and think about our relationship with the land, to think about our relationship with the environment, to think about work and rest and all of these complicated things. And so as we kind of enter into that period, I'll probably, I can't help myself. I'll probably try to write something about Shemitah because I find it so interesting.
And that's something that I know nothing about.
Yeah.
So if you do a piece on that, you should come back and we should talk about it specifically, because that'd be super fun. Okay, so Dr. Adrienne Krone, wonderful conversation, so wide-ranging. I'm wondering if you can tell people where to find you if they want to follow along on this journey that you're on within public scholarship to, follow you if they want to know more about your work?
Absolutely. So I'm on Twitter, very boring handle, at Adrienne Krone.
Wonderful.
And so that's a good place. One of the lessons we've learned through Sacred Rites is how to use our Twitter platforms maybe a bit more to promote our own work. And so I will be consciously trying to promote my own work through my Twitter account. And so that's a good place to check.
Fabulous. And for any listener out there, the links to that Twitter and to Sacred Rites will be in the show notes of your podcast app. So go ahead and go underneath the episode in the podcast player, and you'll find that exact link just so you can get all the spellings correct and everything. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This was amazing.
Coming to my house is so nice. It's just so nice to be able to really socialize for real and to talk about all this fantastic work. I have learned so much, and I'm really grateful to you for your time and energy, especially driving all the way to Buffalo and hanging out. It's really just a special interview for me.
Yeah, happy to do it, and always happy to both drive to Buffalo and talk.